We're looking here at my solution for the East Coast Yachts forecasting problem. It's the end of chapter problem from chapter 3 of your textbook. This is Microsoft Excel we're looking at here. I've cropped the screen a little bit so that you can't see the top of it with the menus and buttons and whatnot, but you can see quite a bit of information here, and you can see my formula bar if I need to refer to that. All of the given information from the homework problem is basically in this column. So this is the original income statement data, scrolling down the original balance sheet data, etc. Our task is to forecast this information 1 year into the future so that we have an idea of what next year's financials will look like. We're going to go through several different iterations of forecasting. We're going to start on this tab of the spreadsheet with a fairly simple forecast, and then we'll get a little bit more complex each step we go so that you can see how we can change the assumptions to get different results. This basic forecast asked us in the textbook to compute the sustainable growth rate for this firm and then to assume that the firm will grow at that growth rate over the next year. So in order to do that, we need to know the formula for sustainable growth. This is the formula in your textbook for the sustainable growth rate. It's return on equity times the small case b there refers to the retention ratio, and then divide that by 1 minus return on equity times the retention ratio. The retention ratio simply tells us what percentage of the firm's net income gets retained and added to retained earnings on the balance sheet. So here's the formula for computing the retention ratio. It's simply additions to retained earnings divided by net income. We knew last year we had $46 million of net income, and out of that $46 million, $17 million and change was paid out as dividends. Whatever is not paid out of dividends must be retained, and therefore the additions to retained earnings is the $46 million in income minus the $17 million in dividends, which gives us almost $29 million in additions to retained earnings. So if you take that number and divide it by that number, that gives us our retention ratio right there. So about 62%. So then that percentage, 62%, becomes an input here to the sustainable growth formula along with the ROE, and we can determine that this particular company has a sustainable growth rate of 15.64%. Now in normal circumstances, sustainable growth rate is not an actual growth rate, it's a conceptual cap on growth. What it specifically means is that's the fastest the firm can grow without accessing external capital in such a way that the leverage ratios for the firm change. So it's the fastest the firm can grow without changing its capital structure is the technical interpretation of that. Now, I want to make sure you understand that all those gyrations we just went through were only required because that's what the textbook asked us to do. We don't normally need sustainable growth in order to do a forecast. We just need a sales forecast. The textbook asked us to do this particular forecast where the sales growth will equal sustainable growth, so that's what I've done here at the top. And when it comes time to actually forecast the financials, all of our forecast values will appear in this column here, which I'm calling pro forma, that simply means forecast. The whole trick here in our basic forecasting technique is simply figuring out which items from the financial statements will vary directly with sales and which will not. We're going to take a very simple set of assumptions here on our default forecast, and we'll assume almost everything is going to vary directly with sales. I'll point out some special circumstances in a little bit of things that may not change with sales, and we'll handle those differently. But starting here at the top of the income statement, you can see almost everything is varying directly with sales. So all I'm taking is the original values, I'm multiplying by 1 plus our sustainable growth rate of 15.64, and adding 1 to that growth rate will force the growth to occur. So sales growing at a rate of 15.64 translates to this amount. Cost of goods sold growing at a growth rate of 15.64 translates to that amount, etc. So you can see all of these top 4 items I'm assuming will grow at that assumed growth rate. I should point out that depreciation is a very special case here. Depreciation is quite complex. It's one of the toughest things to forecast accurately. In the real world, if you want to forecast depreciation accurately, you call the accountants at your firm and ask them what they think depreciation will be next year. Since we don't have the ability to talk to East Coast Yachts accountants, we're making some very simplifying assumptions here. Specifically, you can see in this little box, I tried to explain it, we're assuming that all fixed assets grow at the same rate as sales and that depreciation is a constant percentage of fixed assets each year. So if those two things are true, we can apply that growth rate to last year's depreciation to forecast next year's depreciation. Once we've got those top 4 items forecast based on the growth rate, the bottom half of the income statement just falls out as a result of mathematics. EBIT is just a subtotal, taking sales and subtracting the next 3 items. Interest expense is the only really tricky part here. In our basic forecast, we will hold interest expense constant. The reason for that is because we don't yet know how much the firm may need to borrow. And since we don't yet know how much we'll need to borrow, we don't yet know what interest expense will be. So our default simple forecast setting will be to hold interest constant. We'll allow for changes in interest later on, but for now, keeping it simple, interest should be constant. That gives us another subtotal of taxable income. That's just EBIT minus interest expense. And then we're going to just use a very simple tax system. We're assuming a flat 40% tax rate. So this cell is just 40% times taxable income. Subtracting taxes gives us another subtotal. That's net income. And then using our retention ratio from last year, we can figure out that 62.16% of that net income will be retained. So that's how we get this additions to retained earnings. And the dividends are just whatever they have to be in order to make net income that balance. These 2 items have to always add up to that item. So if we know what the additions to retained earnings would be, we can figure out the dividends, or vice versa. If we know the dividends, we can figure out additions to retained earnings. So that's our simple income statement forecast. It's quite simple. As long as we can figure out these top handful of things are going to grow at the growth rate, they're easy to determine. Remember, depreciation is a very special case here. We had to make some pretty strict assumptions to get that number. Then the only other real trick is to hold interest constant. If we do that, the rest of the income statement just falls out from mathematics. And then these 2 items down here we determine by assuming they'll have the same pattern as they did last year. 62% of net income to retained earnings, the remainder to dividends.